Is the former Ukrainian defense minister Fedorov going to run for president? Are Fedorov's supporters going to force an election during wartime, something that's prohibited by the Ukrainian constitution? And is Iran going to control the Strait of Hormuz permanently? Hi, I'm David Dubato, and we're going to be discussing those and some other stories on this edition of the No Delusion Zone for Monday, August 24th, 2026, with my very special guest, Timothy Ash. Welcome back, Tim.
Hey, great to be here.
Same here. Thanks for coming back. As I said, let's just launch right into it. You had a recent piece that I believe was originally on your Substack, reposted on the Kyiv Post, that talks about that lead story that I just talked about, Fedorov. There's been some talk recently from him, actually, about the possibility of him running for president, but more importantly, that he called for elections. And your piece is called "What is Fedorov Thinking?", which is, I think, an excellent title. And there's the man himself, again, former defense minister of Ukraine, Mikhailo Fedorov. And your piece opens, "The big news today is former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov calling for elections in Ukraine. To be honest, I didn't see that coming and struggle with his logic." I'm not going to read any more of your quotes because you wrote them. So let's just get right into it. What do you think about I mean, I know what you think about this. I've got a lot of questions. Why don't you let me know what you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously Fedorov has a good reputation, seemed to be messed around quite a lot by Zelensky, and Zelensky obviously, you know, is great at external media and PR stuff. But in terms of domestic politics, kind of makes a lot of mistakes and errors, right? I mean, often in the people he chooses and doesn't choose, and the cabinet reshuffle that resulted in Fedorov being sidelined, it was a bit crazy, right? I mean, you know, he seemed to be the most effective defense minister Ukraine's had. Obviously, he's been pretty instrumental in pushing its sort of drone advantage forward. You know, but then he was kind of fired, and you know, was also fired. The assumption she was going to be the ambassador in the US. I mean, then there's all the corruption stuff as well. Obviously, continue to kind of hang around the kind of story. I mean, people assume Fedorov had presidential ambitions. I just think that this was, you know, I mean, again, he's great at technology, but maybe also, you know, being a good politician is maybe a different thing. And it seemed to be kind of jumping the gun. And, you know, I mean, look, it's hard. It's really hard to hold elections in time of warfare, right? I mean, if you think of Ukraine, you know, it's population. You know, there's people in, you know, the occupied territories. You know, millions of people. There are millions of people displaced internally, and then there's millions of people outside the country. I mean, its population's gone from something over 50 million at the time of the Soviet Union to probably something around 30 now. I mean, how do you do that, right? And is it a priority, really? I mean, or is it just a diversion and a distraction, diversion of resources and a distraction? And actually, opinion polls, you know, don't suggest a great clamour for elections. I mean, not early elections. Elections, they should have been held last year, and they weren't because of the war. I saw one poll: 57% of Ukrainians don't support early elections. I mean, I get it, right? I mean, I get it. You know, Putin keeps, you know, playing the line that, you know, Ukraine's not a democracy because it's delayed elections. He's having state Duma elections, obviously, over the next month. You know, he keeps implying that Ukraine is not a democracy. So I guess Fedorov suggests, you know, we shouldn't be scared of elections. We should, you know, prove our advantage. You know, it should be within our competency to do elections with all the technological advantage. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that, right? I mean, it's going to be incredibly challenging, right? And, you know, in the end, does anyone really take Russia's democracy seriously? You know, in last week, what we had, Yablocka banned from running. You know, many people remember, you know, Yablocka is, you know, one of the, I guess, founding parties in terms of democracy in Russia, you know, Yavlinsky and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I don't think people take the comparison seriously. I think people understand that Ukraine's a country subject to full-scale invasion, war, etc. I mean, you know, the UK didn't hold elections during the Second World War. I don't think people were complaining. I mean, I think the population want politicians to focus on, delivering victory, right? And the criticism, Fedorov, I think, was on the BBC and argued that Zelensky do more about the width of corruption about his cabinet, and asked what did he know, even though saying that he didn't see any evidence that Zelensky himself was corrupt, but that perhaps Zelensky's tolerated corruption. And I don't know that, but there's been many arrests and resignations and sackings around corruption in Zelensky's administration. But actually during the war and before then, right? I mean, I think most people will accept he hasn't done enough in that area, and so I think Fedorov's points kind of do hit home. But just looking at Fedorov himself, I mean, I think this probably showed his ambition, his own political ambition more than anything, right? I mean, I sense this was a pitch by him for early elections, and he'd probably stand as president, right? But I think it was a mistake. And I mean, will it be terminal for his political career? I don't know. I mean, he's still popular, right? He probably will run in a future presidential election, and we know the contenders, right? It will be probably Zelensky, Zaluzhny, and Fedorov. Obviously, probably Poroshenko, and as always, Tymoshenko, right? But but anyway.
Well, to be honest with you, when I read this, your piece, but even before that, when I heard his announcement about this and his, and I watched some of his interviews, it said to me, and I'm a strong supporter of Fedorov. I mean, he was great. I mean, I still don't understand why he was fired, but that's something else. But the fact that he called for early elections during the war, even though, as I said, it's prohibited by the Ukrainian constitution, to me, said that someone who is brilliant in one area is not necessarily so brilliant in another. Meaning, I think he somehow, I don't know how, doesn't grasp the implications of what he's saying, and that he doesn't, at least he's not admitting the chaos that would ensue, most likely, if an election were held now. And that, contrary to his statements about how democracy shouldn't be hindered by the fact that there's a war, this would in fact throw a democracy into chaos and would be playing directly into Putin's hands. And I just fail to see how he could understand that. But again, I think it just confirms what I'm saying, which is that being brilliant in one area, which he is, doesn't mean that he would be a brilliant leader. And in fact, in my opinion, he's damaged his brand very much, whether, as you said, it's irreparable, well, permanently, I can't say the word, whether it's going to damage him forever in the political arena, I don't know. But I don't think it did him any good. That's what I'll say about that.
I mean, just imagine, a campaign now. I mean, look at what happened in Romania recently with the presidential election, right? Yeah. I mean, do we really believe that, like, we can that social media won't sort of create, momentum behind division candidates, and extreme candidates? And I mean, it worries me a bit that maybe, obviously, Fedorov seems to have good relationships with some tech bros, Elon Musk and the Plantier guy. And, obviously Musk has been vocal in criticizing Ukraine for not having elections. So I just wonder if, in a way, Fedorov is, pandering to that constituency and perhaps thinking that in the future that Musk might back a future presidential campaign by Fedorov. I mean, personally, I find Musk incredibly worrying from a democracy point of view. So I'm not sure any hookup with Musk is necessarily a positive thing for a politician anywhere, particularly. But
no, and I agree with you. And Tim, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the fact that Fedorov, and I think you're right, I think he may have been thinking about Musk, how he can't see what a danger Musk is to democracy, how he can't see how this is playing into the hands of Putin. It escapes me, even though he's never, played himself off as a politician. He is a tech guy, a brilliant tech guy who has revolutionized drone warfare and, was responsible for the successes of Ukraine while he was there. How he can't envision how what he's saying is just a detriment to Ukraine is beyond me. But all I can say is right now, I think he's done himself great harm. Let me ask you this though: do you think his supporters, after he's done this, are going to be as rabidly behind him as before? Are they going to support his presidency? Do you think that he's promoted himself well, or is this going to damage him even with his supporters?
Look, we all make mistakes in life, right? I mean, hopefully we
Oh
can
yeah.
learn. I mean, look, I mean, I said he did a great job in the defense ministry. I think Ukrainians certainly appreciate that. Is he dead as a political entity in Ukraine? Probably not. I think people would like to hear more about these thoughts about early elections, where they came from, his thinking around that. Eventually elections will have to be held in Ukraine, right? Absolutely. But I just think with the winter, I mean, obviously the winter coming up and concerns about missile defense and all that stuff. I mean, that's a priority. I mean, Zelensky himself, obviously we have the 35th anniversary of Ukrainian independence coming up. All these world leaders in Kiev at the moment.
I think it's today, actually.
Today, I guess Zelensky's basking in. He's good at that, right? He's good at meeting world leaders and appearing on the rostrum and saying the right kind of things, and that's been good for Ukraine, right? I mean, he's done a great job in making sure that Ukraine sustains that foreign support, even though the Trump administration's kind of pulled back, right? And you could see, with the UK's decision today to allow local production of Scalp and the Storm Shadow missiles. I mean, that's a major decision by certainly the Brits and the French, I think, in support of the Ukrainians. And again, Zelensky is very good at all that stuff.
Yeah, and that's what one of Fedorov's criticisms are, that Zelensky is paying more attention and lip service to foreign leaders than he is to domestic issues, which I would take exception to. He has to do that. He has to, talk to foreign leaders. He has to try to develop better relations with them. They are desperate. I mean, Ukraine needs foreign support. They need allies right now. So I understand why Fedorov would say that, but I think in your piece you actually said that even Britain during World War II didn't hold elections. That's a common thing, that when you're in a war, in a crisis situation, suspending elections is not an anti-democratic move. It's an existential move, because it could create, as I said, more chaos than it's worth. So I don't know. This whole thing with Fedorov just rubbed me the wrong way, but I agree with you. He's not done. I mean, if anything, he's going to be one of the main candidates going forward after the war is over. Let me go on to one of our favorite people right now, which is Putin. And and I'm going to just post a piece here, and I'd like your opinions on this. Putin says that Ukraine opened a Pandora's box with strikes on economic targets, and I'm just going to read some from excerpts from that piece. And it says, Russian President Vladimir Putin said in comments published on Saturday that Kiev had opened a Pandora's box with its strikes on Russian economic targets, saying that Russia would hit Ukraine's most sensitive economic sectors. Ukraine has this summer escalated a campaign of drone strikes targeting Russian economic infrastructure, including oil refineries and online retailer warehouses, seeking to destroy infrastructure it says essential to Russia's war effort. Russia has responded with strikes against Ukrainian economic infrastructure, including Ukrainian grain exports via the Black Sea. The Kyiv regime set out to damage our economy. What did it do? It opened this Pandora's box itself. Well, then, expect a response targeting your most sensitive economic sectors, Putin said in comments to a Russian state television journalist. Your thoughts on all of that claptrap?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some truth in it, unfortunately, that I guess we're in a phase of the war where both sides now are escalating. I think there was probably a window a month or so ago for some kind of peace process. I think that NATO summit played well for Ukraine. Obviously, Trump seemed to pledge like the Brits and French on Scalp and Storm Shadow, that Ukraine would be able to build Patriots, and then Trump pulled away from that almost, right? And it sent a pretty clear message, I guess, unfortunately, to Putin. And then there's been lots of commentary since that Ukraine's kind of running out of Patriots. Some of the latest ballistic missile strikes by Russia against Ukraine. I mean, I think 100% got through, right? So in a way, it's Trump mismanaged all that, and the end result's been almost a green light to Putin that Ukraine's defenses are down. There's this opportunity, this window of opportunity, while its air defenses are in such a weak position, to max ballistic missile firings in Ukraine and kind of wear away Ukraine's industrial complex and its military industrial complex. So I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. And Ukraine's obviously it's also doing that. I mean, you mentioned the refinery attacks, the wild attacks, what we're seeing in the Black Sea. I mean, both sides basically have made the Black Sea now, unnavigable basically for each other's vessels or vessels coming to its ports. And that, I mean, I think from a Ukrainian perspective, there's a desire to, I guess what they've seen is what's happening in the war in Iran, right? I mean, essentially, Iran, had its nuclear program. It thought that was the deterrent. It got attacked even though it didn't have a nuclear weapon, but it had a program. And then it discovered this new deterrent was its ability to close the straits and impact on Gulf states around it and impact on the global economy, right? And the fact that Trump seemed to ignore all the interests of its allies in Europe and Asia in terms of the Iran war's impact on global energy markets and their economies. He just went ahead and did it. And then you go back to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians for years now have been asked by Western allies not to hit Russian assets that have global market impact. So they've kind of pulled punches against the Russians. But now the Ukrainians are saying, well, wait a minute, we were told not to hit Russian assets that have impact on the global economy, but you're doing exactly the same now. You're acting in your interest, the US that is. So actually we're going to act in our interests, right? So that's what they've been doing. So hence the attacks on refineries, the Wildberries and online retailers and all those kind of things, and also what's happening in the Black Sea, right? So I think it's probably the message is that only by having a global impact do people like China, etc., care enough to maybe put pressure on the Russians not to do it. So I see what the Ukrainians are doing, but unfortunately, I guess at the moment we're in max escalation stage from both sides, and probably we'll see Ukrainian attacks move from the Black Sea also to the Baltic Sea. So it strikes me as we're seeing escalation in Russia-Ukraine, right? Because there's no peace perspective. Again, Russia sees this opportunity because Ukraine's missile defenses are down, and Ukraine, sees advantage in escalating to have impact on global markets to give it leverage in some kind of peace process, right? Meanwhile, obviously, we have the situation itself in the Straits with the Iran situation not great as well. So all that kind of points to these two conflicts having an impact on the global economy, right? Keeping oil and energy prices escalated, which is, it's bad for everyone, right? Bad for global growth, bad for global inflation, but particularly bad, obviously, for people living in Ukraine, right? I mean, no real end in sight at the moment. I mean, the sad thing is, I mean, the irony, right? I mean, Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, announcing, max sanctions from hell, or he calls it D-Day sanctions, D-Day equivalent sanctions on Iran. I mean, Iran is, in my mind, sort of limited systemic risk, really, or existential risk really to the US, right? I mean, this war was a war of choice in Iran. But you've seen when Trump's ego is under threat, they seemingly are willing to do something significant in terms of sanctioning Iran. So, but they've been pulling punches on Russia, right? I mean, I think many people have argued, including yourself, right, that, if Trump had imposed max pressure on Russia right from the outset of his presidency, which meant doing more in terms of sanctions and increasing military supplies to Ukraine, it would have suggested there is no winning formula for Russia. And Russia, increases the risks and costs for Putin of carrying on the war. I mean, that's the essential feature here, and he hasn't done that, right? And he's continued to pull punches when it comes to sorting Putin out. Whereas, with the Iranians, he seems to be willing to do a lot more. I mean, on those Iran sanctions, anyway, we're probably going to talk a bit about it later. But the key thing really is what China's key trade partner, as with Russia, right? I mean, how China has played the Russia relationship despite Western sanctions. So anyway, lots of interesting things going on anyway.
Well, you're right. I mean, I've talked about the fact that especially America could have strangled Russia a lot more than they have been with sanctions. They've just been, they've been very kind, shall I say. The Trump administration has been very lenient with Russia, where they, from the very, very beginning. And let's go back. Let's be honest with you. Biden is the same thing. I have been equally harsh, if not harsher, on Biden, not just about the lack of enforcing the sanctions against Russia, but in terms of supplying Ukraine with the weapons that they needed. But once Trump came to power, it's even gotten worse, because whereas Biden tend to couch his actions towards Ukraine and Russia's region, we're going to give Ukraine as much as it needs. Trump has been pretty blatant about the fact that he really likes Putin, and that he doesn't want to tick him off or piss him off, and that he really doesn't like Zelensky. So, I mean, the only difference is I think it's been more blatant. But I also wanted to say that I can believe the hypocrisy, but the hypocrisy from Putin saying, that he's wounded, he's gravely wounded and insulted about how Ukraine is now targeting Russian infrastructure, both business and civilian logistics and warehouses and so forth, is just unbelievable. The way that he has slaughtered Ukrainian civilians, hitting malls, nursery centers, hospitals, libraries, apartment buildings for years. And now he's angry that the Ukrainians are doing the same thing, but to a much lesser degree, because they still don't have the ability yet, is just absolutely nauseating. But what I want to go into, because we are going to talk about Iran in just a little bit, but to further this topic, yes, Ukraine has been upping the ante and escalating it, as you said. Here's just a recent article about 3 killed as Ukrainian drones target ozone across southern Russia. How much do you know about that, Tim? I mean, most folks that follow this at all are familiar with wild berries and the fact that Ukraine has just really hammered the wild berries warehouses. Its nearest competitor in Russia is Ozone. I think they're the second or third largest such business in Russia. How much do you know about them, and how much do you believe that if Ukraine continues pounding them, it's going to affect the smaller businesses within Russia, as it has with wild berries?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess much has been made of the fact that we're almost into the 5th year of the war, and the Russian population have not really suffered that much, right? The war's not really come home, unless you're probably a family of probably the 1 million or so Russian casualties in the war, right? But most of those, I think, are from poorer regions of Russia, rural areas, the south, the Muslim south of the country, right? But not from the politically important big cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow, right? Which have historically always been the key ones. I mean, I think the Ukrainian strategy now is gloves off, let's take the war to Russia. That's been reflected in the hits on refineries. Something like 30% of Russian refinery production has been taken out of production. The result is that Russia which was a big exporter of refined products, is now importing refined products, remarkably. And because it doesn't have the capacity to refine crude, it's having to export more crude than it normally would, which is good for global markets, right? But obviously the shortage of refinery creates this crack spread, this difference between refined product and crude. I mean, that's big problem for the global economy. But with the refinery problem, we are seeing shortages of fuel. We are seeing long queues again at gas stations. In the last week or so, it's got a lot worse. And then you could put the attacks on those online retailers like Wildberries, etc., in the same context, right? I mean, Russians have, like everyone globally, embraced the online kind of marketplace, right? I mean, I think Wildberries does something like 700,000 transactions every day, right? I mean, that's what 5 for every Russian in the Russian Federation, right? So those disruptions, I mean, there's lots of different numbers around, but something like 40% of Wildberries warehouses have been taken out. That what will be the impact of that? There'll be disruptions. Russians won't be getting their Putin calendar for the or whatever it is they get. There'll be shortages. There'll be higher prices. Those online retailers are also key to the broader supply chain in Russia, and Russian companies also use these online retailers. And the Ukrainians say that they're also key parts of the supply chain for the military-industrial complex, particularly drones. So again, that will be disruptive there. And the losses incurred because of the destruction of stock, I mean, estimate around $5 billion in terms of Wildberries. I mean, that will reverberate throughout the economy, right? I mean, depends who takes that hit. If it's the hundreds of thousands of small retailers that distribute through Wildberries, a lot of those will go out of business. It will see increasing non-performing loans of banks, I would imagine, higher bankruptcies, lots more disruption, right? And the economy already. I mean, I've been doing some work looking at sort of broader macro trends, and what was pretty evident is, if you go back, Trump did do something more significant last year, which was the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. We saw the European Union $46 oil price cap. We saw those deep strike drone attacks by the Ukrainians. So what we saw in the first couple of months of the year, February, was the Russian economy was in recession. It contracted by something like 1.8%. And actually, throughout the war, the Russian economy has grown, right? I mean, the sad fact that there's been fiscal largesse. They've spent a lot of money on defense, and it's kept the economy, going along at a reasonable pace. But actually, that the economy did slow down quite significantly in the first 2 months of the year, and I think it was related to the fact that the buffers that had been built up before the full-scale invasion have been eroded gradually. I think there were, if you look at some of the business surveys, the central bank runs a survey, and there's also an S&P Global survey. If you look at those surveys, businesses are complaining about tight labour markets, high labour costs. You can't get skilled labour, logistical problems. I think those Wildberries, etc., tax are causing problems there. Fuel shortages. And the high cost of borrowing, right? High interest rates. And obviously, the war has created an inflationary problem. Those attacks on refineries makes that even more difficult. And to counter inflation and stabilize the exchange rate, basically, the central bank had to run very high, very, very aggressive interest rate policy, high interest rates, right? So businesses don't seem very happy, right? So that was the story kind of the first couple of months of the year, and the fiscal deficit exploded, and the current account surplus that had narrowed very significantly because Russia, if you remember, in the first couple of months, Urals was trading at like a 30% discount to WTI and Brent. So Russians were getting something like $40 a barrel, more or less, something like that. I think 45. So Russia's fiscal balances were looking pretty poor. And then, unfortunately, Trump decided to attack Iran. And that bolstered oil prices in the short term, and it was like manna from heaven for Putin. And then suddenly a lot of those numbers turned around. But actually, again, it hasn't really resolved the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is, inflation, high costs of borrowing, labor shortages, logistics problems, all those kind of things. And one really interesting developments, I think, in the last week or so was reports that Andrei Klepach, who was the chief economist at VEB, Vneshekonombank, right? He's been around a long time. He used to be deputy minister of economy. I remember 20 years ago, when Russia was in a different place or heading in the wrong direction still, we used to take investors to see Klepach, and he's very well respected economist, right? Anyway, he was fired apparently because he came out with some comment in a publication saying that the war was pretty much a disaster for Russia and there's no kind of way out, and he suggested that the risk that it would cause a social explosion in Russia, comparable to 1917, the Russian Revolution, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anyway, clearly the reference to the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't go down very well with Putin.
No. Right. Can't have any of that. No.
The fact that a member within the regime, a respected economist, kind of told it as it is, right? That there is no way out of this for Russia. There is no
good way out. Yeah.
Going to get worse, I think was quite telling. And certainly looking at the data, the macro data now, that escalation you spoke about earlier, right? Putin promising revenge on the Ukrainians. Well, it's going to get a lot more difficult for the Russians as well. And I think that it's not inevitable that the regime survives. Russians it's going to be a lot more difficult for Russians now. The war is going to be brought home to them. And I think they should be asking, what's all this about? Why? The irony really, when you think about it, is Putin goes on about the greatest catastrophe was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we had this fraternal kind of union of all these different peoples in the Soviet Union. We all loved each other. I mean, he's been the guy who's killed, apart from Stalin and Hitler. I mean, Putin has killed millions. He's got Ukrainians and Russians who he sees as one people killing each other, right? I mean, that's his failure, right? And he's also responsible for obviously the wars, the brutal end to the Chechen wars, Georgia. I mean, he's killed plenty of people throughout the former Soviet Union, right? Bad.
Well, I want to pursue this a little bit more as far as the Russian economy, and then we're going to switch gears and go into Iran. You talked about how the Russian people are just very, very starting to feel a little bit of the fact that the war is affecting them. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically it's saying that because of the wild berries, specifically the wild berries burning, being destroyed by Ukrainian drones and missiles, that Russian small businesses are really, really hurting. So finally, the Russian government said that they're going to draft some legislation which will bring some financial relief to the Russian small businesses. However, they're not going to bail them out. They're going to let them not have to pay their taxes right away. They will have to pay it in the future, but for right now, they're not going to have to pay the value added tax and some other liabilities while they're basically going bankrupt. Having said that, let me ask you this. There's been quite a few stories written recently, the last several weeks at least, about Russians withdrawing cash, withdrawing money from banks because, of the problems you just talked about and the fear that the banks may actually collapse. So the Russian economy is collapsing. How important is that? Is that just media fervor, trying to get stories? Or in fact, do you believe that the Russian people at this point do sense some greater economic collapse and that this run on the banks is something to keep an eye on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not sure it's the end of the line already, right? But, Russians probably have a memory of that period at the end of the Soviet Union, the early period of the Russian Federation. The Wild West, wild economics, devaluation, default, right, through the 1990s. And, when they see queues again at petrol stations, probably when they see shortages because of the Wildberries attacks, probably, they think to themselves, well, maybe the outlook's not as great as we perhaps thought it was. Maybe the stability that Putin has delivered over 20 odd years, etc., may not be there forever. Let's just get a bit of our money and put it under the mattress, right? So I think that's probably what we're likely to see. But the future is very uncertain for Russia, I would say. It's interesting, but Oreshkin, who I think is deputy prime minister, he's actually an economic advisor to Putin, seen by many as a potential successor to Putin, and seen as one of the brightest economic brains in Russia. I mean, he's recently put together an economic program to deliver to Putin, right? And really, the message from him has been that the prior kind of the buffers in the system that enabled Russia to get through 4.5 years of war have been ridden through, and we need a different model now, right? And I think it's a state investment-driven kind of model. But the interesting thing for me is that even people like Oreshkin understand that it's not sustainable. What Russia has been doing to survive this war, they can't carry on this current trajectory, right? And that he talks a lot about use of technology and all that, AI and all this bullshit. But basically, I think the longer this war goes on, the more difficult it's going to get. Ukraine has, I think, a technical advantage in certain spheres, particularly deep strike drones. Financing is a much less of a problem because obviously the Europeans have stepped up. There's 90 billion loan facility from the European Union. The Brits, the Norwegians, the Canadians, the Japanese are also providing funding. And we've seen increasing, cooperation between European NATO countries, Brits, French, Danes, to help the Ukrainians further have that advantage so that they can cause havoc in the Russian economy. It's only going to get worse. They have vulnerabilities, the Ukrainians, air defense, Patriots, etc., definitely. But I think, the Ukrainian, I guess we will continue to see the Ukrainians trying to bring the war home to Russia, right? And, Russia is still sanctioned. When they hit refineries, it's hard to repair them, right? Because it's hard to get the critical equipment because, all of that stuff is under sanctions, right? So, I don't really see a way out particularly. I mean, the war can certainly go on 2 to 3 years more, unfortunately, bad for both sides. But I think the risk for Putin now is that you see systemic failure. And actually, interestingly, and I think we spoke about this last time, and again, linking to the Iran war, oil prices are very uncertain, right? I mean, predicting future oil prices is a bit of a nightmare. But, there's still a possibility that the end result of the Iran war may well be substantially lower oil prices, not higher. I mean, in the short term, it's hard to imagine that, given the kind of stresses are still there. We've still got the blockade and all that kind of stuff. But, if the net result of the Iran war is a fracturing of OPEC and a supply war between key producers, that means a glut of oil, and maybe 1-2 years down the line, and with much lower oil prices, and Russia cannot play in that supply war because of the fact that Ukrainians have been hitting their capacity, and it's subject to sanctions, right? So Russia would then face lower oil prices and probably lower production, and probably a catastrophic hit then to its fiscal and its balance of payments. And I think that you asked about the banking sector, right? I mean, if we see oil prices sustained at, say, $40 a barrel, 45 for an extended period of time, I think that would create the systemic failure in the Russian economy and in the banking system, and you would see bank runs and bank failures. So and it's not, it's a possibility, that those global oil prices go there. I mean, again, it's not necessarily a base case for the next year, but slightly longer than that. And I think the Russians have to think about that, right? You could end up with complete systemic collapse of Russia, right? Because of perhaps trends of oil prices and the fact that Russia can't compete in terms.
Well, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but the fact that the Russian economy has even been able to survive this long after 4.5 years years of war is well, not solely, but in large part because of the defense sector. The people that are employed and making the most money right now are working in the defense sector. They've been laid off from or fired from the badly for labor, and they've been employed in factories and so forth to make weapons, to make bombs, to make tanks, to make drones and ammunition and so forth. And so without the defense sector right now being as well funded as it is, there basically isn't a Russian economy for the most part.
Look, I mean, Russia went into this war, Putin knowing, I think knowing long ago that he was going to start a war with Ukraine. So they built up buffers, they deleveraged. If you think of public sector debt, I mean, Russia has had a public sector debt ratio of less than 20%, right? There has been, big fiscal spending, despite the fact that oil prices have been elevated in the period since the full-scale invasion. Russia has been running a budget deficit, right? So you have seen resources diverted from consumption to defense, but eventually, that runs out, right? And as I said, some of the resource constraints in the economy, particularly labor, has resulted in high inflation, or much higher inflation than I think Russians have become accustomed to, right? So, and as Russia is sanctioned, it's not able to tap international capital markets. So really what you have is state-owned banks funding the deficit. It's essentially the monetization of the deficit, and that's ended up in inflation, right? Again, I think we're at the limits in terms of that model, as Oreshkin and Klepach and these Russian economists close to the regime have been admitting openly. It's only going to get worse, right? Even a bigger guns versus the butter kind of debate. The more resources Russia's military-industrial complex consume, at the moment it's probably 8% of GDP spent on defense, right? I mean, that's much less money for everything else, right? And you see that in the data, actually. You see the two-speed economy. I mentioned earlier that, the Russian economy contracted by 1.8% in the first 2 months of the year. Actually, over the 6 months, it grew by something like 0.3%, as far as I'm aware. Now, within of that 0.3%, you could imagine the military-industrial complex was probably booming, right? It was probably growing at, 10% or something like that, which would mean the rest of the economy was not doing very well at all, right, to get to that 0.3 overall real GDP growth number, right? So I think what it shows is a large section of the economy is in recession, is struggling with, as I mentioned previously, high interest rates, labor shortages, high labor costs, and rising delinquency and bankruptcies, etc., which will feed through to the NPLs in the banks, right, and undermining banks' balance sheets. I mean, eventually, there will be a crash, right? Eventually, there will be that run on banks. There will be a devaluation. But it depends how long the war goes on. The longer the war goes on, the more likely that is to happen, and the more likely when it does happen, it will be a systemic event in Russia. A systemic event, I think importantly, I think defeat in war or a failure to secure victory with huge human with an economic crisis because of that war or because of global commodity price trends and Ukrainian attacks, I think could risk the sustainability of the Russian Federation itself as an entity, right? And that's a nightmare scenario, obviously, for Putin, the Russian establishment, but also China, etc. So, you would hope that, faced by that, the high risk of continuing the war, what it could mean for the survival of Russia as a state, that the Russians would say, well, actually, maybe it's best to do a peace deal now. Let's try and negotiate while we still have some leverage.
Well, as I say in just about every podcast I make about Russia, it's this change, if it happens, it's not going to come from the Russian people. It's just not. They can endure the unendurable That's been their history for 800 years. This is just the latest chapter in that. Sure, some of them are starting to get annoyed and irritated on the fact that their groceries are very much more expensive. The gasoline shortage and the lines at the petrol stations and all that. Yeah, but other than that, they don't. I'm not saying they support the war, but they don't oppose it either. They're just neutral. They're oblivious because they put their heads in the sand. They don't listen to news. They don't read the news. They don't care. They kind of bought into Putin's, offer that if they don't bother the government, he won't bother them. And so, again, if a change happens, it's going to be because of a total economic collapse that's forced on them, or the security forces, whether it's the FSB, the intelligence services, or the military, are going to have to change it. I don't see the oligarchs changing it either, because they're too tightly tied into Putin. But in the time we have left, I do want to obviously talk about Iran. So let me, forgive me if I have the wrong thing here. Nope, this is what I want. Questions rise as the U.S. claims deeper control over the Strait of Hormuz. No, that's not the one. No, and that's not it either. Maybe this will be it. Yes, basically, it's saying that the sanctions haven't worked. And the fact is, and I'm going to summarize this, folks can read it if they want to. It's up on the screen that, America's allies now, especially they mentioned here, Japan and South Korea, are going to have to choose between a reliable energy supply, meaning something coming through the Strait of Hormuz, or participation in America-backed sanctions, further sanctions against Iran. Will they choose the United States, or will they go with the new order that Iran is creating? And Tim, a new order, as you know, is being created, and it's being forced on the world by the United States. Iran didn't start a new world order. They reacted to it. And I'm just going to read one sentence from the second paragraph. Iran will probably sustain its control over energy flows for at least a couple of years. And the article further goes on to say that there are plans to try to build a workaround from the Strait and the Persian Gulf to try to get oil and gas to Western and Asian countries other than going through the Strait of Hormuz. But even that plan, which hasn't really been finalized yet, is subject to attack by Iranian missiles and drones because it's still in range of those weapons. So that's probably not going to work either. So the bottom line and the thesis of this story is that because of the United States and Donald Trump specifically, Iran's going to control the Strait of Hormuz. They're not only going to control it, they're going to control who goes through, when it goes through, who doesn't go through, and how much they can charge countries to go through the Strait of Hormuz to get their energy supplies. I think this is a worldwide catastrophe in the making. It's obvious to anybody that you don't have to be a well-respected economist like yourself. The fact that Iran is now going to dictate the energy needs and prices for at least the next several years. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, look, big subject. I mean, I think...
well, you're just the man to discuss it and lay it out for us.
Look, Iran's mistake was having a nuclear program without a nuclear weapon, right? And that nuclear program got them attacked. It proved that deterrence wasn't worth very much. But by making the war existential, right, by going after the leadership of the Islamic Republic and telling everyone that it was about regime change, it made it existential to the regime, and they lashed out in the only way they could, which was hitting Gulf state assets, which were, it's a target-rich environment, very close, and then closing the straits, right? And they discovered the deterrent. The deterrent that they, maybe didn't realize they had was the ability to impact on global markets, right? And it's hard to take that away, right? Unless the Trump administration is willing to do whatever it takes to engineer regime change, which clearly they're not. I mean, you're American, you're based over there, I mean, the boots on the ground, Americans are just not willing to do that, right, in a foreign war. So Trump's constrained what he can do. He's gifted the leverage to the Iranians. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the ability to divert oil supply around the Gulf, or the southern route, etc. I mean, I just think in the end, it's we've seen with what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. In an era of drone warfare, it's impossible to have 100% defense against drones, right? It's a war of iterations. The Iranians are clever people, right? I mean, they have a technology engineering class. There are so many assets in the Gulf they can hit to have, to have a meaningful impact on Gulf states, but also on global markets. That in the end, you have to deal with Iran. Well, you have to deal with Iran, which means either, embarking on a military campaign to ensure regime change, or you'd cut deals, right? You buy Iran off, and basically, I guess the Gulf states have come to the realization, including UAE, that actually they just need to learn to live with Iran, and that has to be, the asset freeze has been eased, sanctions lifted, and we had this 300 billion investment suggestion by Trump, but that was the basis of obviously the MOU. I mean, the difficulty is that the MOU in effect was a total humiliation for Trump, right? I mean, everyone, the media coverage around that, Trump's got this problem with Obama, and this competition with Obama, and it's clear that the MOU was going to be worse than JCPO, and I think Trump couldn't for whatever reason, it just pained him so much that he's not been able to come to grips with that, and so he's kicking and screaming not to sign not to comply with that deal. And that's what we're seeing now. We've seen this, this effort at max economic sanctions in terms of the MOU. I mean, I think it's six and one half a dozen of the other in terms of compliance. Like both sides are complaining about the other one in terms of complying with the actual MOU. And I think both sides are probably at fault to some extent. I mean, Iran, I think its interest is, it has this leverage now. I think it's worried about its leverage over time eroding, perhaps as it does worry about diversification away from the Straits, even though I think that's difficult personally. And it thinks it has the kind of their foot on Trump's neck now, and this is the time to get max upfront concessions in terms of, as I said, asset freeze moderation, sanctions moderation, and some kind of investment pledges. Remember, for the Iranian regime, their biggest problem ultimately they know is the economy, and the fact that the political protests we've seen in Iran in recent years have significantly been driven by the poor performance of the Iranian economy. So if from this deal they can get significant, economic wins, then that perhaps makes them think that actually there's a future for the economy and they can moderate that political opposition domestically. So it's pretty important for Iran. So look, I think unless Trump is willing to go all in militarily, which is not, I think in the end it'll end up with some kind of deal and some backtracking by Trump. He'll have to eat some humble pie. Maybe he's just waiting for the midterms, right? I mean, I think what's interesting for me in a way that, not signing a deal has kept oil prices elevated and kept prices at the pumps for Americans for gas, high, right? Most people, the consensus had been that Trump would cut a deal and hold to a deal up to midterms to keep those gas prices low, and then maybe go back to something later. Actually, it's been the opposite of that, right? I think Trump can't bring himself to accept defeat by signing a bad deal, and it would be a bad deal for the US, ceding control over the Straits in effect to the Iranians. And for whatever reason, he's willing to live with high gas prices and presumably a bad performance in the midterms. Maybe the midterms don't really they don't really matter that much in reality for Trump. Maybe he's focused on 28, right? Trump 48, maybe something like that. Maybe he's got some strange.
Well, to be honest with you, Tim, I don't think Trump's worried about the midterms because he's going to control them. I've been saying this for, well, at least a year, that the Republicans have and have had a serious plan about controlling the midterm elections. I don't mean canceling them. I mean controlling them, whether it's through voter intimidation or more likely appointing people to count the ballots after the election, Republican MAGA people to count the ballots, the old Stalin thing where it's not how many votes are cast, it's who counts the votes. And that's right part of Project 2025. I believe that's what's going to happen. He's been saying that's what's going to happen. But as usual, people tend not to listen to things that Trump says a lot of times, just saying, oh, that's just the way he talks. It's Trump being Trump. You shouldn't listen to him, blah, blah, blah. No, you have to listen to him. So I don't think he's worried about the midterms because I don't think he's going to win. The Republicans are going to win because he's going to force them to win. Let me ask you a question about this. Maybe it'll be the final question, maybe not. It depends on what you think. Maybe I'm being naive, but this whole problem with Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz, which they will, at least for the near future. I'm sorry, there's just no other way around it, in my opinion. Wouldn't it be better for Western nations, all of Europe and certainly the United States and even our Asian allies, to pour all the money that they are spending now supporting their oil and gas industries and refineries and import fees and this, that, and the other thing, or trying to create workarounds for the strait, pour all that money and more into alternative energy sources, which, yes, it would take a lot of money, but it's going to take a lot more money when the price of oil and gas goes up, or if there's another war where they can't get any or very little. If they spent that time and money developing alternate energy sources such as solar and wind and so forth, they wouldn't have to worry about Iran. They can do one of these. And it wouldn't really matter because that's all the Iranians have as leverage. Am I being too naive or just stupid or what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that has happened and it will accelerate because of these geopolitical problems in the Gulf and with Russia, Ukraine, etc. Right? I mean, the reality is one reason why, the impact of oil at $90 a barrel has been less impactful on other global markets, particularly equities and perhaps global growth and inflation, all those kind of things, is energy intensity has fallen. We have seen efficiency improvements, particularly in Europe, right? I mean, much more advanced than the US. So that's given some durability to Europe. And yes, we'll see much more investment in those areas. And eventually, you're right. I guess the carbon transition will happen ultimately 10 years down the line, and Iran's that will be the biggest ability. Well, we talk about Iran's ability to reduce leverage, right? I mean, maybe not, right? Because in the old days, the Gulf states were just exporters of oil and hydrocarbons, right? I mean, we now have these countries developing these visions, right? Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030. It's all about diversification away from hydrocarbons, right? So, and the Gulf region now is a hub for tourism, global logistics, loads of different things now come out of the Gulf, and again, this makes the Gulf a target-rich environment, right? It still gives Iran, I think, the ability through drone and ballistic missile strikes to cause havoc, on the global economy. I mean, imagine. Iran has, it has hit, obviously, it's launched massive drone and ballistic missile strikes against Gulf states. But actually, they've been very targeted, right? Some people have died, unfortunately. But actually, they've avoided mass casualty events, which suggests that actually their targeting is pretty precise. So, I think the Iranians probably could hit, and actually their attacks on US bases have been, obviously the problems with US carriers. It's incredible what the Iranians managed to hit in terms of the US bases in the region and US logistics hubs that have caused such difficulty for the US carrier fleet to sustain itself in this war. I mean, what I'm saying is that, beyond the carbon transition, I think Iran, just because of its location, will continue to have an ability to disrupt Gulf states, which now are systemically globally important, systemic to the global economy, right? I mean, they're financial hubs, right? I mean, I said, major airline logistics, etc., but funded by Chinese money, right? So if the Iranians wanted to cause global systemic impact, I mean, they could just take a major airport out in one of the Gulf states, or real estate targets, or hotels, or whatever it is. And though what would happen probably is a lot of those Asian investors that still have some kind of assurance in terms of the survivability of the regime, maybe they'll exit, right? And then you'd end up with some kind of global financial crisis. So look, I think Iran's leverage is kind of here to stay. I think that's the reality. And in the end, I think unless the US and its allies and Gulf states are willing to do something to engineer, actually deliver regime change, which they don't seem to be able to or willing to particularly, then, I guess you have to come to some kind of accommodation with Iran, which is what the Gulf states are saying, right? I mean, that's a clear message from the Saudis, the Omanis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis. I mean, maybe not UAE as much, although UAE even seems to have come around to that view, that in the end, you've got to cut a deal with Iran, right? And maybe eventually, under its own failed policies, you will end up with a regime change in Iran, maybe some years down the line. I mean, the irony perhaps is that, the Islamic Republic seemed to be really struggling, before the 12-day war and before the events at the end of February, the launch of a full-scale war. I mean, maybe if the US had left Iran alone, we would have seen more mass demonstrations, and eventually the regime would have been forced to change from within, right? But actually what's happened is, in a way, this external regime change factor and how catastrophically bad the war was conducted, particularly those attacks on schools, etc., big civilian casualties. This message that maybe Israel was trying to launch a civil war using Kurds, it seems to have united the much of the country behind the regime, which is ridiculous and extraordinary, right? That this failed war has probably strengthened the Islamic Republic, if anything.
Well, let me just close on this thought. If, in fact, what I'm saying may happen in November, which is that the Republicans will either they win it outright or continue to control the government regardless of the methods used, I don't think that the American military, at least, is going to be able to counter the massive drone and ballistic missile arsenal that Iran apparently has, because even with $1.5 trillion, which is the budget for the U.S. Military, the Pentagon next year, $1.5 trillion, we're still building things like aircraft carriers and manned new generation fighters and bombers. We're not pouring most of our money into unmanned weapons systems, drones specifically, or even anti-drone warfare. We're devoting just a very small amount of that $1.5 trillion to fighting today's and tomorrow's war. We're still pouring weapons into what we used in the last wars. So if that's the case, if old Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump are in charge after this November, we're going to be having a woefully inadequate military as compared to what Iran is able to field. And that's all I'll close on. Any closing thoughts on what we talked about today, Tim?
No, I think you're totally right. I mean, those reports that Army Secretary Driscoll is going to be sidelined or removed or whatever.
Right.
That brigade or whatever it was in the US military that was focused on drones was disbanded. It's just extraordinary, right? I just find that utterly remarkable that, Ukraine, I mean, we started talking about Fedorov right at the outset, right? And I guess, one of the key drivers of technology in the defense of Ukraine and use of drones, right? I mean, that's been surely the big lesson for everyone from the war in Ukraine and the war in the Gulf is that drones are the future of warfare, right? And we should all be maximizing our investment in those. And the US and NATO allies need to be working with the Ukrainians, who are getting frontline battlefield experience, with drones and all that kind of stuff. And to think that the Americans are kind of, are pulling back on all that, that just seems like I get, the perception that China is the existential threat. Well, the Chinese are learning from all this, right? Definitely, right? We see
yes,
in robotics, we have to learn from what's gone on in the Gulf War and the war in Ukraine. And you'd hope the US, with that massive budget, would have smelled the coffee, right?
No, we're still building, like I said, not only next generation fighters and bombers, but Stryker fighting vehicles, the tanks, as I said, aircraft carriers. My God, Donald Trump is building, forcing them to build battleships. Because he likes to play with World War II models. And so he's got Trump battleships coming online at the cost of, I don't know how many billions each. So it's a disaster. Look, we're going to have to close on that because I could rant on for a very long time. And I know you could too with your good information, but we're going to have to leave it there. Tim Ash, thank you very much for today's conversation. I am sure we're going to be talking again soon. Until then, you take care and stay safe, sir.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And to the rest of you, you all also take care, stay safe, and try to stay sane.